Hello, this is Lauren with Lauren Watkins Art, and today I will be painting an ocean wave using my Graham Watercolors, and I will also be using the iridescent inks and the white Bombay India ink from Dr. Ph Martins. I will be working on 140-pound Arches cold press watercolor paper. This is in a square shape, and I will be using masking fluid to protect the areas of the paper from paint, as you can see me applying right now. I start off by sketching the wave, and then I apply the masking fluid to the areas that I want to preserve the white of the paper. Once the masking fluid is completely dry, that is very important that you let it dry all the way, I start by wetting the paper, and then I go in and add light layers of watercolor washes over the top. I'm doing a wet and wet blending using a wet paper and wet paint to allow the color to spread and create very soft blends. The reason why I work with such light layers at the beginning is because with watercolor you work from light to dark instead of the typical dark to light that you would with oils or acrylic paints. Watercolor is a very translucent medium, and so whatever's underneath it will tend to show through. So you would have to get an opaque gouache or ink, like I will use later on, to show up on top of the dark layers. So to save myself heartache or stress, I start light and I gradually build up the colors in a process called glazing. So with the paper still wet, I went in and I added some more shadows that eventually blended out and softened on the edges. I dried the paper completely, and then I went in with more masking fluid. The type of masking fluid I am using is Fineline masking fluid. If you watch my videos a lot, you would be very familiar with this because it is my favorite masking fluid because you can get such fine details with it. Again, once the masking fluid was dry, I went in and started adding more layers of color. I'm just building it up and keeping the paper wet and really doing soft washes right now, and just looking at where I want those shadows to be within the water itself and protecting the areas that I want to be lighter. The reason why I went in with the masking fluid on top of the watercolor is because masking fluid can protect the layers that you've already put down. So I know I'm going to want some pale blue highlights within the water, and so by using the masking fluid over the top of that, I've already preserved some of that. Now I'm coming in with a green color. This is a phthalo green, and phthalo colors tend to stain a lot, meaning you can't lift them, you can't move them really easily once they're on your paper. And so when you lay them down, you want to make sure you're laying them down in an area that you know for sure you want it to be in, and to go in with a gentle hand and not oversaturated in color, because you can always add more, but it's very hard to take it off. And now I'm just creating contrast with the water by adding some more sky, or adding this sky and having it be nice and dark. And again, just layering it up. With the watercolors, really good watercolor paper like Arches allows you to do these layers without it picking up the layers underneath, and that is called glazing. So you paint a layer, you let it dry completely, and then you paint more layers gently over the top of it, and you build it up. Since I'm working in thin layers, so not super saturated with color, and I'm drying in between each layer and gradually building it, I'm able to get some really great texture, color saturation, and detail within my watercolor paintings by just taking my time and glazing. Another thing to help with glazing is to make sure you're using a soft paintbrush. Stiff paintbrushes can disturb the paint that you've already laid down, the pigment particles, and it can also damage the paper with repeated brush strokes. So just make sure you're using a soft brush when you're glazing. So this painting is actually inspired by a series of ocean watercolor paintings I did several years ago. I was recently commissioned to do a new one for a client's house, and I needed to get back into the mindset of painting with watercolor and painting ocean waves again. It's probably been 4 to 5 months since I've done a serious watercolor painting. I've worked in my sketchbooks a lot, which I'm really glad I have been, but I haven't worked on a painting that I spent a lot of hours on, that was on Arches paper or really nice watercolor paper. And so I needed to get my brain back into that. The paper that you work on in watercolor really affects how your paints react and layer and how you approach it. And so I needed to get back onto the paper that I was going to be using in the commissioned piece. Because the Strathmore paper in my sketchbook just responds differently. It behaves differently. And so I can't use the same techniques that I use with that on the Arches paper and vice versa. And then I also needed to kind of get comfortable with mixing colors again and layering them, especially with the ocean or water in general, because water is a translucent thing. It gets light shining through it. It changes color depending on what's near it or underneath it or on top of it. And so you have to approach painting it a little bit differently than you would something that was opaque. And so I did this piece to kind of get me back in the mindset so I could work on the piece for my client. This piece also was a great practice piece to help me kind of figure out what proportions and ratios I wanted to use in the finished and larger scale painting, because the original wave paintings I did were in a landscape for the most part. And so how I proportioned them and how I laid them out was a little bit different. And this one is going to be a square, like in my sample painting, and I needed to kind of see how it would look, how it would lay out, all of those different things I needed to kind of brainstorm. And I did some brainstorming on my iPad, but because I do a lot of my sketching and beginning design work on my iPad, but there's some of it that you don't fully pick up on or know how it's going to completely look until you actually do a sample piece. And so that's kind of how this picture came about, and it was really fun to kind of get my brain working again in that way and kind of figuring out what I want to do. I already know what things I want to tweak from this picture to what I want to tweak and apply to the larger painting. So I'm going in and I've just been adding layer upon layer of paint and gradually building up the color and then drying it between each layer. Now you can see I just dried the paper and now I'm spraying it with water. That's because I wanted to create a softer blend between some of the layers I had done. I noticed they were getting a little too sharp, so spraying the whole paper with just a little bit of water helped soften the edges because it reactivated the paper or the paint that was already laid down. And then I'm just going in and flicking some dark paint right along where the white of the top of the wave would be. I don't know what you call that part, but I'm just adding some dark paint up there to help create texture. Because as we go in a little bit, we're going to want to have some contrast within the white of the foam-y bits. I don't know what you call the white part on a wave, but I want to make sure I'm getting enough contrast and texture to really make it look like the wave and particles of water are flying up. Now I'm taking a rubber pickup. It's just like this square block of like rubber, and I'm just rubbing it over the paper to pick up all of the masking fluid. I made sure the paper was very dry before I did that. And then once I took all the masking fluid off, I'm going in with an old kid toothbrush and my Bombay Indie ink and starting to add the texture and the highlights on the wave. And then once that was dry, I'm coming in with some very pale washes of color to start to subtly add the shadows in those highlighted areas. This is really important to keep it from looking too flat. I'm also adding really, really dark paint to create more contrast and dimension within the water. So I'm just really gradually building this up and looking at seeing where contrast needs to happen, where shadows need to go, where highlights need to be, and just adjusting as I go. This will depend on what you want your wave to look like, on how dark and contrasting you want it to look. My client wants this to be a slightly more stormy looking ocean wave, and so I'm creating a lot of contrast to help evoke those feelings of it being stormy. So I'm just coming in with the toothbrush again and flicking some more white around. I'm just focusing on where I want the highlights to be. So that's where I'm focusing the splatters. This paintbrush was kind of getting clogged up with ink, and so I switched to a paintbrush and a piece of paper to kind of help focus where I want the splattering. And I'm just dabbing it, and you'll see me use my finger in a minute to help smudge it and just create a lot of texture and dimension. Don't be afraid to get your fingers dirty when you're painting. Oftentimes my fingers are my favorite tool when I'm working. Once that layer of ink dried, I'm going in and adding some more washes of color over top of the ink to start building up more and more of that dimension in the painting. And then I'm doing some washes of purple and Prussian blue into the sky to help it contrast against the white of the top of the wave. And the reason why I'm adding purples and greens to the picture instead of just doing different shades of blue is because it helps add a lot of dimension and texture and interest to the picture. It keeps it from looking too flat. It has contrast within value and contrast within color, and it helps keep the picture interesting. So now we're at the stage of the painting where we're just making more subtle tweaks and adjustments and taking a step back and then coming back and adjusting things as we go along. Sometimes you don't even see much of the change until you see it all kind of added together, and you look back at a progress picture you took a couple hours before, and then you realize how those subtle tweaks made such a big impact on the painting. So I added some more shadows to the water, and then I'm going in and adding more highlights. I just keep going back and forth. I feel like a broken record, and I'm just repeating myself over and over again. But doing that is what takes your picture from looking pretty good to a lot more realistic, or to the next level of quality and skill, is taking that time and putting in that extra effort, even when it doesn't seem like it would be that noticeable. Once I got that layer of white ink in, I came in with my iridescent inks, and I started doing my favorite part. One fun way to make these pictures kind of look iridescent and watery was to add these iridescent inks, because it shimmered and shined, and it kind of changed how it looked depending on how the light was sitting, and I thought that was a fun tweak to add. I'm also adding white iridescent ink, so I added green iridescent ink, blue iridescent ink, and then I have this white silvery one that I've added that you can see kind of shining up in the white of the paper. And it makes it look so pretty up on the wall, and as you walk by the painting, it just kind of glimmers and catches your eye, which I really, really love. And so I'm really excited to do this painting on a large scale for the commission and see it taken to the next level with being on a different scale. So that is pretty much this painting. I hope you enjoyed watching the video, and I hope you were able to pick up new tips and techniques on how to use your watercolors. If you did, please hit the like button, and if you would like to see more of what I create, please hit the subscribe button and notification bell. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I will see you next week. Bye.